students, welcome to Sozen Classes. I'm Neelima and I'm going to help you prepare for the rapid revision module for economy. Well, before we start off with the classes, let's quickly look at what is the schedule for this classes and what are the course content and what is going to be taught in this module. The course is going to be for 12 days. So let's quickly look at what would be covered in these 12 days. So day one, we would start off with what's the scope of the subject, of course. I've already told you that. And the prelims perspective, what's the approach, and we would look at the introduction to economy and economics. So what is economy all about? What's economics? The differences, what's micro, macro, what are the various sectors of the economy and things like that. And then we would move on to look at economic growth and its measures. So which would be, we would be looking at the production, the concepts of production, and the microeconomic concepts, the production concepts, and of course all the national income estimates, the concepts like GDP, GNP and so on. So all the measures, how do you measure, because you know growth is extremely important. Every country wants to achieve economic growth. So how do you measure economic growth? So that's what we'll be looking at. So that would be the day one. Day two, we would be looking at economic development and its measures. If you look at it, generally students think growth and development, economic growth and development are the same, but actually they both are different. So we'll be looking at what is that difference, right? They go very synonymous. You say growth and development. Growth is quantity, whereas development is quantity as well as qualitative aspects. So we're going to look at what is the development part of it, what's the classification of countries there, and we would also be looking at what are the measurements of development. As we measure growth, similarly we also need to measure at development too. So we'll be looking at what is development and the role of the Planning Commission. What was the Planning Commission, and today what we have is Niti Aayog. So how they help in economic development, and of course the recent trends of aspirational districts program by the government, what is sustainable development, and the Sustainable Development Goals given by the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Index. So that we would move on to the next part of it, which is the poverty and unemployment. Now, poverty and unemployment go hand in hand. They're like twins. Obviously, people, if they are unemployed, they will slip into poverty. So, in order to have people slip out of or alleviate people from poverty, meaning we're talking about eradication of poverty, we require more number of jobs. Employment is extremely important, right? So here we would be looking at what is poverty, what are the measures, what are the various estimates, the committees, and of course the recent one about the randomized control trials, wherein that's the concept behind what the 2019 Nobel Prize for Economics, which was for tackling global poverty. So we will be looking at that, and then we'll move on to unemployment, look at what is unemployment, the types of unemployment, all the reforms like labor laws, and we'll be looking at the child labor, and finally we'll wrap up that segment with skill development, because you know if you want more jobs you need to be skilled, and therefore we require skill development for that. So what's the government's idea about skill development and how are they going about it? I'm sure you all heard about the Skill India program. So that's where we wrap up day two. Day three, we would go on to inflation, the concepts of inflation and money. So inflation, what's inflation, and what are the measures of inflation, and what's inflation targeting, the types of inflation, and we would move on to look at money, the concepts of money supply, the concepts of the money aggregates, the money multiplier, monetary policy, the monetary policy tools, and so on. That would next, we would go on to day four and the entire concept of banking, the banking sector, and what role does this banking sector play for the Indian economy is what we will be looking at. So that's the banking sector, all the concepts related to banking. We would be looking at the structure of banks, the NPA problem, the recent crisis, the NPA crisis, the resolution of NPAs, and all the recent ones, along with the non-banking finance companies, as well as we'll wrap up with the Basel norms. So this would be our day 4 plan. Let's move on to our day 5. Day 5 would be all about the markets, what you would want to know, the financial markets. So we're talking about the short-term markets, which are also called as the money markets, and the long-term markets, which are called as the capital markets. So we'll be talking about the stock markets and the various investment options, the various instruments that are available, and we would be looking at also the commodities market and few important terms which are there for the stock markets or for the entire financial market. So that brings me to day 6. So day 6 is all about taxes, the direct taxes and the indirect taxes. So that's all the concepts related to taxes we'll be looking at on day 6. So day 6 is taxes and public finance. So what do you mean by this word public finance? The word public here means the government's income and its expenditure. So we will be looking at, of course, the budget, the fiscal deficit, what's the income and expenditure of the government, how do they manage the FRBM Act. We'll be looking at the entire fiscal consolidation, the concepts of the Finance Commission, what are they proposed, and so on. And then finally, we'll wrap up with the first fiscal stimulus that has been announced by the government for the economic growth very recently after the COVID. Just few days back, the finance minister has announced a fiscal stimulus. We'll be briefly discussing about that. That brings us to 50% of our course. So day 7, we will be looking at the external sector. External sector talks about imports and exports of the government. You talk about the balance of payments, the balance of trade, and we will be looking at the rupee versus the dollar and who fixes these exchange rate, what are the different types of the exchange rate systems that are there, and what is the connection of the gold prices and the oil prices, and how they impact the value of the rupee and so on. We'll be looking at the gold monetization scheme, the foreign exchange reserves, special drawing rights, and of course the very recent concepts of the very recent current affairs related to devaluation of currency, which China had done recently, and the currency war between the United States and China. So we'll be looking at that. Then comes to day 8. Day 8, we will be looking at the most important international economic organizations and certain issues which are economic issues related in the international organizations. So, and of course, we would also be looking at the most important summits that take place in the world, like the G20, the BIMSTEC, the BRICS summit, and so on. Right, and that would wrap up our day 8. Day 9, we would very exhaustively look at the agriculture sector, the entire agriculture sector in detail. So all that you need to know about the agriculture sector and the allied activities of agriculture sector. There is a whole plethora of content wherein you should know about the land reforms, the subsidies, the minimum support price, and you talk about the farmer producer organizations, application of information technology in promoting agriculture sector, like in terms of ENAM, the online, as part of the Digital India program. And we would also be looking at organic farming, the food processing that is so important for uplifting the agriculture sector, the food processing industries, and recent current affairs in terms of what are smart foods and the golden rice, and of course the Essential Commodities Act. We'd be looking at all of this and the supply chain infrastructure for the food processing industries. So with that, we wrap up the agriculture sector, and day 10 we move on to the industrial sector. Industrial sector, right from independence, the industrial policy with the reforms and all that is being done until the Make in India. We are talking about industrial parks, we're talking about disinvestment, privatization. So we'll be looking at all of that in the industrial sector. Then we move on to day 11, which is infrastructure and investment. So the entire thing related to transportation. So what's the plan we have in terms of transportation in railways, roadways, airways, waterways. We'll be looking at logistics, the multimodal logistics, the logistics policy that the government is planning to come up with, the energy sector, the electricity, oil and gas, and water and sanitation. So all the infrastructure that is required and the investment that is required for India to move forward. So we'll be looking at all of that, and of course we'll be looking at the investment models that are there as part of the infrastructure development in terms of a public-private partnership and so on. And finally, we wrap up the course on day 12 with our human resources and social development, which would be looking at some demographics and some social development areas like health, women and children, education, and the marginalized section. And then, of course, how could we not discuss the 2020 issue of the COVID-19 and the economy pre-COVID and post-COVID, and what is the plan India has for 2020 and beyond. And with that, we wrap up economy. Thank you, and please subscribe to Sozen Classes.